Hello again. So, how did you do on the quiz? Did you remember that the model training is called the training set and the model feature selection is the validation set? And that quantifying generalization you do with the test set. That's letter C. So, probably you all remembered that. Well, let's keep on keeping on, okay? We need to talk a little bit about model selection, about how you figure out which version of a machine learning algorithm you want to use and how you're going to set all the dials on it. So I want to just throw out an important principle. Right? This principle came to me from my second father, and he worked in a power plant, and everybody who was an operator in the plant hated all the engineers because all the engineers could do was, use fancy things and basically make stuff that broke. Well, so the operators in the plant, they had a very important rule. They called it keep it simple, stupid, the KISS rule. In data science, you're often in a situation where your data it can be easy to find patterns in your data that aren't really there. And because there is so much rich data out there, if you apply a complicated machine learning model, you might end up finding things that are not true. Okay? So in general, while you are operating as a data scientist, unless you have a really good reason where you have a knowledge about why you're choosing this, you should generally prefer simple models. Simple, like even to the point of starting with regression, right? Okay. So let's start with regression. Let's talk about supervised learning. So remember that supervised learning is where somebody has come in and produced a set of labels for us. They've taken the data and they've said all these are sick people or all these are healthy people. Okay? So there's inside of supervised learning, there's two broad classes like we've already talked about. There's regression algorithms. Regression algorithms predict continuous variables, right? So something which is on the real number line, something like an age or a number of people expected to vote in a certain county. Okay? Classification is where we predict categorical variables, something which is a small discrete number. So you either have a high school diploma, a college undergrad, a master's degree, or a PhD, or maybe you have a Cisco networking certificate. I don't know. But no matter what you add on to it, you have a small discrete number. Okay, those are categories. Well, let's go into detail. What does a regression look like? So we're going to take a look at regression. Continuous variable. So in regression, there is an independent variable, right? This is the thing that we're looking on the x-axis. The independent variable is independent. It is just what happens. It's the thing which is going to implicitly that we're going to be looking at as a factor that could, at the very least, predict the dependent variable. The dependent variable on the y-axis is dependent. And what is it dependent on? Its value is dependent on the independent variable, right? So this thing down here is what it's dependent on. All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to use the fact that in a linear regression, that we're assuming there's a linear relationship between the variables to generate a predictive model. Okay? So we're going to take the training data that is given to us in our data dump, and we're going to fit a line to it. Okay? The linear regression models the relationship, this implied relationship that height is going to determine age. Okay? How could height determine age? Well, again, we may not be operating in a causal way, right? It could just be that there is some third thing out there which causes changes in height for different ages. Well, it's pretty easy that height with age does change with childhood development. So if we're in age ranges that are appropriate there, we could be seeing that. But if we're talking about old people, maybe there's something like back in the day they had poor nutrition, right? And so older people coming from an older group that had less nutrition are shorter. All right, but whatever. The point is not to solve this particular problem, but to see how regression works. Well, how does it work? So you see these red lines here? These red lines are the residuals or the errors, okay? So each one of these points is a little off of the line, okay? What is regression doing? What regression's doing is it's summing up all those red lines, and it's trying to minimize their sum, or more to the point, actually, minimize the sum of the squares. So whatever this error is here, this is an E, sorry, E1, E2, E3, all those little lines, we're going to call them the errors. We're going to square them and then sum them all up, all right? That is the sum of squared errors. And it's summing up all those little red lines is a term that what regression does is it tries to minimize it. It tries to move the line around, looking for the place that it can put the line, which makes all those red lines as a sum the smallest they can be. All right. So that is what regression does. It is minimizing the sum of squared errors, minimizing all those red lines. Once we've done that, once we've found the one line that does the best, that minimizes all those little red errors, then that is now our prediction. So when we get new data in, so some new person comes in, new data point, they are this tall, we can jump up to the line and then jump across to the age. And that's how we're going to make a prediction. All right, capiche? Any questions on that? You're all very silent today. I must be lecturing really well. All right, so let's take a look at classification. Okay, classification is, again, the discrete version of the same thing. So we're going to look at classification through a decision tree. A decision tree is a very, very basic classifier. It's also one that is very easy to understand for somebody who hasn't been through this machine learning stuff before. Okay, so let's say our data involves people's information, including their salary and some other stuff, right? What a decision tree does is it looks through all these variables, and if what we're trying to do is predict somebody's education level, remember that's what we're after here, right? We're after their education level. That's our goal, is to predict that. What it's going to do is it's going to look through all the variables that we've got in the data set, and we're going to pick out the variable which is most informative, potentially, right? If we do decision trees one way, we're going to find the variable which best splits people into one or the other of these levels of education. All right? So maybe our algorithm finds a threshold at $40,000 on salary as being the one thing we can do which is going to separate people the best into one educational class or the other. So If your salary is less than $40,000, you go over here. If it's more, you go over on that side. And then maybe it picks the next most informative dimension to the data set is whether you work in a manual labor profession. Okay, so if you go down the tree, then the next question is manual labor or yes or no. And then we're going to keep adding branches to the tree, 2 branches at every point, picking a dimension of the data which is useful for making the distinctions we want to make about what's your education level. So maybe the next one is children, the next branch down. Oops, I went too far. So finally, when we get to the end of the tree, labels will be applied to the leaves, okay? So it's called a decision tree because it has this branching structure. And therefore, this is called the root of the tree. And these are the leaves. Okay, you'll come to learn that quite a lot if you're not already familiar with it. It's a very common computer science-y thing to have a tree like this. But decision trees are special because what they're doing is they're making decisions about, in this case, what is your level of education. All right, so then when we get a new sample, right, some new person comes in, we want to predict what is their education level. Well, we can just follow the path through the tree, taking the turns until we come out whether or not they are in high school or a grad school kind of person. All right, so decision trees, yeah, they're good for classifying things. And once again, they are a supervised algorithm. To create them, you had to have labeled training data, just like the regression. Now, the flip side of machine learning is the unsupervised learning, right? Where what we have is something which is not labeled, where the algorithm is extracting information and regularities that are helpful by itself. So the data just comes in, it goes into this model, the model identifies patterns and produces an output, a prediction. So here is a list of things which can be unsupervised, okay? Or are unsupervised. So maybe less about that, about the exact algorithms, because to understand what they all mean requires a course in machine learning, or a couple of them. But maybe focus more on this, right? What do we use these kinds of things for? Well, they can be useful for exploring a data set, doing exploratory data analysis. They can be useful for finding useful features in the higher dimensional data. Or we can also use it for finding, we can use it as a categorizer, okay? But we don't have to. But what I'm going to talk about is it as if we are using it for a categorizer, okay? So let's say we got a bunch of data, a bunch of emojis coming in, and we throw it into a model, and we would like to know, is it cake? Well, hopefully it spits out an answer like this, where it clusters all the things together that are not cake and everything together that is cake. That would be an ideal algorithm for that. Well, the thing is that we never told it to go looking for cake, right? We didn't tell it cake or not cake. We just put the data of the emojis in, and out came these 2 clusters. So there's no cake label here. What happens is you come through after the machine learning unsupervised algorithm creates these clusters, and you, after the fact, post hoc, you come in and label the categories as cake or not cake. You don't label every single instance, right? If you did it over here, you'd said that was cake and this was not cake, then that would be supervised learning. That's not what we did. We threw the unlabeled data in, we got out clusters, and afterwards a human being labeled the clusters. Okay, so then in the end, you can take a new emoji, it comes in and you make a prediction. Is it cake or not cake? Now, finally, I just want to say one word about unsupervised learning. Again, that there are other ways of doing this, right? That we might want to find useful features in higher dimensional data or use it to explore a data set. So this kind of exploratory data analysis is very common in the sciences, okay? So if I have the 20-some thousand protein expressing genes and I have data for biological samples looking at how much of each one of those protein expressing genes is expressing protein at a given time in a biological sample. So I have 20,000-ish variables. That's ridiculous, right? We can't work with 20,000 variables. So instead of drawing a 20,000 dimensional graph to look at the data, I may use something that's unsupervised to find a lower dimensionality embedded inside that higher dimensionality, right? So what I'm talking about is if I have a flashlight here, right? And I have something that I set in front of the flashlight, like a coffee mug, okay? That is a 3D object, and it's going to produce a shadow that I'm going to draw poorly, okay? Okay, on a wall, right? That's the shadow of the object. Now, that's taking a higher dimensional thing and projecting it down into a lower dimension. So that's the kind of thing that unsupervised algorithms are often used for, this kind of dimensionality reduction. And what happens is, after you do that with 23,000 dimensional data for the protein coding genes, then we get it down into two-dimensional data. And what you'll see is that those biological samples end up in situations like this, where we're like, oh, those are healthy people, and those are sick people. Okay, we've taken the 23,000 dimensions of gene data and turned it down into 2 dimensions, and we've found something useful in that. So this kind of is a very common way to use unsupervised machine learning algorithms. All right, so I'm going to take one more break, and we'll come back and do some model assessment.